October 25, 1944, dawn broke over Leyte Gulf, with a blood-red sky that would soon justify its ominous hue. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi stood before 23 young pilots in a cramped briefing room on Mobilocket Airfield in the Philippines, his weathered face bearing the weight of a nation's desperation. The war had turned catastrophically against Japan, and what he proposed that morning would forever alter the nature of aerial warfare. The formation of the Shinpu Takebetsu Kogekeitai, the Special Attack Unit, soon to be known worldwide by a name that would echo through history: Kamikaze, the Divine Wind. Lieutenant Yukio Saiki, a skilled pilot with a wife waiting at home, listened as Onishi outlined the unthinkable. Japan's conventional forces could no longer compete with American industrial might. The solution, Onishi declared, was to transform men into guided missiles, crashing explosive-laden aircraft directly into enemy vessels. One plane, one pilot, one ship. This was the terrible mathematics of Japan's final gambit. According to accounts preserved in the Japanese naval archives and later documented in multiple historical analyses, including publications by the Naval Institute Press, Onishi gave the pilots one night to volunteer. By morning, all had raised their hands, though whether from genuine devotion, peer pressure, or the impossibility of refusal remains debated by historians to this day. Across the Pacific, at naval air stations in California, Texas, and Florida, American pilots underwent training of an entirely different philosophy. At Naval Air Station Pensacola, Ensign Robert Anderson completed his 50th carrier landing practice on a makeshift deck painted on the runway. American doctrine emphasized one fundamental principle: bring the pilot home. Every aspect of training, from gunnery to evasive maneuvers to emergency procedures, focused on survival and reusability. Pilots were investments, not expendable weapons. Each American aviator represented hundreds of hours of training, thousands of dollars in resources, an irreplaceable combat experience. The contrast could not have been starker. While Japanese instructors began teaching young pilots the optimal angle to dive into a ship's bridge, typically 5 degrees to penetrate deck armor, American instructors drilled their students on recovery techniques, damage assessment, and how to nurse a crippled aircraft back to a carrier. The Japanese Imperial Navy Aviation Manual, sections of which were captured and translated by Allied intelligence after the war, contained increasingly desperate modifications. Experienced pilots were pulled from frontline service to train raw recruits in weeks rather than years. Many kamikaze pilots had fewer than 40 flight hours, barely enough to take off, navigate, and locate a target, let alone engage in aerial combat. The cultural foundations underlying these divergent approaches ran deep. The Bushido Code, the way of the warrior, had been resurrected and weaponized by Japanese military leadership. Ancient samurai values of loyalty unto death were fused with emperor worship and nationalism. Young men were taught that sacrificing oneself for the emperor and nation represented the highest honor, a belief reinforced through education, propaganda, and social pressure from childhood. Meanwhile, American military culture, rooted in democratic individualism and pragmatic efficiency, viewed each soldier's life as valuable. The goal was victory, certainly, but achieved through superior technology, training, not through mass sacrifice. January 12, 1945, snow fell lightly on the grounds of Kairan Air Base in southern Kyushu, where 17-year-old Corporal Hajime Fuji reported for kamikaze training. The base, now preserved as the Seiron Peace Museum for Kamikaze pilots, would become one of the primary launching points for suicide attacks against the American fleet gathering for the invasion of Okinawa. Fuji had been drafted directly from agricultural school, his education interrupted by the insatiable demand for pilots, as Japan's trained aviator corps dwindled to critically low numbers. His instructor, a weary captain with a missing eye from the Battle of the Philippine Sea, had perhaps 3 weeks to transform farm boys into human bombs. The training regimen was brutally abbreviated. Fuji learned basic flight controls on aging Takakawa K9 trainers. Aircraft so obsolete they were useless for any purpose except teaching rudimentary aviation skills. He practiced level flight, basic turns, and most importantly, the steady dive that would characterize his final mission. There was no instruction in dogfighting, no practice in evasive maneuvers, no training in how to return safely from a mission gone wrong. Such skills were deemed unnecessary for men who would never return. Historical records from the Japanese Defense Ministry archives revealed that the average kamikaze pilot received between 20 and 50 hours of flight instruction compared to the 200 to 300 hours American pilots accumulated before seeing combat. At Kairin, the pilots lived in stark wooden barracks, their days regimented by Spartan discipline. Each evening, they participated in ceremonies where they wrote farewell letters to their families, practiced their final words, and composed death poems in the classical tradition. Local women, later called the Takatai mothers, would visit the base to provide the young pilots with home-cooked meals and maternal comfort in their final days. One such woman, Tom Torihama, whose restaurant and inn near the base became a second home to hundreds of doomed pilots, kept their photographs and letters for decades afterward. Her collection, preserved at the Sharon Museum, provides heartbreaking insight into the minds of these young men.
Ow.
Many photographs show pilots barely old enough to shave, their faces a mixture of determination and barely suppressed terror. Across the Pacific at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi, Texas, 22-year-old Ensign James Mitchell was in month 7 of a comprehensive 12-month training program designed to produce not just pilots, but survivors. Mitchell had already logged 180 hours of flight time in increasingly sophisticated aircraft. He had mastered formation flying, instrument navigation, gunnery, dive bombing, and torpedo runs. Most critically, he had endured rigorous training in emergency procedures, what to do when your engine failed, when you took combat damage, when weather closed in, when you got lost over the featureless ocean. American training philosophy, documented extensively in U.S. Navy training manuals from the period held at the National Archives in College Park. Maryland operated on a tiered system. Primary training taught basic flight skills. Intermediate training introduced combat maneuvers. Advanced training simulated actual combat conditions as closely as possible without the lethal consequences. Throughout, instructors hammered home one lesson: complete the mission and come home. Dead pilots couldn't share their experience with new arrivals, couldn't pass on hard-won tactical knowledge, couldn't fly another mission. The Americans also invested heavily in equipment designed to bring pilots home. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires from tracer rounds. Armor plating protected pilots from behind. Improved life rafts and rescue procedures meant that pilots who ditched in the ocean had a reasonable chance of recovery. March 18, 1945, Lieutenant Commander James Flatley stood before a class of 32 pilots at Naval Air Station Alameda in California, chalking diagrams on a blackboard that illustrated the new kamikaze threat. Intelligence reports from the Philippines and recent operations around Iwo Jima painted a disturbing picture. Japanese pilots were deliberately ramming American ships, and conventional defensive tactics proved inadequate. Flatley, a decorated combat veteran with 14 confirmed kills and a Navy Cross earned at the Battle of the Coral Sea, now faced the challenge of teaching his students how to counter an enemy who sought death rather than feared it. The tactical problem was profound. Traditional aerial combat assumed both sides wished to survive. A pilot being pursued would break off, dive away, or take evasive action when threatened. A kamikaze pilot would do the opposite. He would turn toward the threat, accept damage, and press his attack even as his aircraft disintegrated around him. Flatley's solution emphasized aggressive, early engagement. Kill them at distance, he instructed. A kamikaze at 10,000 yards is a problem. A kamikaze at 1,000 yards is a catastrophe. Your job is to ensure he never gets close enough to hurt you or your ship. The training incorporated lessons learned from desperate battles. American pilots practiced the thatch weave, a defensive maneuver, where two fighters protected each other through coordinated turns, ensuring that an enemy pursuing one aircraft would be exposed to fire from the other. They studied gun camera footage from previous kamikaze encounters, learning to recognize the telltale signs: a Japanese aircraft that ignored evasive action opportunities, that flew steadily toward the fleet regardless of damage, that seemed to accelerate rather than retreat when hit. Reference materials developed by the Naval Air Training Command, now housed in the National Naval Aviation Museum's research archives, emphasized psychological preparation. American pilots were warned that they would face enemies who embraced death, but reminded that fanaticism was no substitute for skill. Meanwhile, At Chiron and dozens of other bases across Japan, a different kind of psychological conditioning occurred. Lieutenant Hajime Fuji, now deemed ready for his final mission after 6 weeks of abbreviated training, attended what the Japanese military termed a departure ceremony. The ritual blended Shinto religious elements with military pageantry. Shinto priests purified the pilots with ceremonial sake. Officers gave speeches invoking the emperor's divine mandate and Japan's mythological founding. The pilots, dressed in clean uniforms with new 1,000-stitch belts, fabric waistbands embroidered by patriotic women, each stitch a prayer for courage, received their final orders. What struck Western observers who studied these ceremonies after the war was their calculated design to override natural self-preservation instincts. The group dynamics were particularly powerful. No pilot could refuse without bringing shame upon himself, his family, and his entire community. The concept of giri, social obligation, weighed heavily in a culture where individual desires were subordinated to collective expectations. Young pilots who harbored private doubts had no socially acceptable outlet for expression. To question the mission was to question the emperor, an act tantamount to blasphemy in the militarized Japanese state. Dr. Saburo Inyaga's examination of Japanese wartime education, published in his controversial work The Pacific War, and drawing on primary sources including military training manuals and student textbooks, demonstrates how thoroughly the Japanese population had been conditioned for sacrifice. From elementary school onward, children learned that individual life was insignificant compared to national survival. The Kamikaze program was not an aberration, but the logical culmination of years of systematic indoctrination. American military psychology, by contrast, affirmed individual worth while channeling it toward collective goals. Yes, American pilots would risk their lives, would fly into withering anti-aircraft fire, would engage superior numbers to protect their comrades. But this courage was predicated on the reasonable expectation of survival, on the promise that skill and luck might bring them home. April 6, 1945. The first mass kamikaze attack against the American fleet off Okinawa began at 1400 hours under clear spring skies. Operation Kaikasui Floating Chrysanthemums, 355. Kamikaze aircraft and 341 conventional fighters and bombers toward the largest amphibious assault force ever assembled in the Pacific. Aboard the destroyer, USS Bush, radar operator Seaman Charles Williams watched his scope bloom with contacts, so many that they merged into a solid mass. He keyed his intercom, raid, inbound, multiple contacts, bearing 340, range 50 miles. The calm in his voice belied the terror in his gut. In the cockpit of an F-6F Hellcat launched from the carrier USS Hornet, the Lieutenant Robert Duncan checked his ammunition, 2,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition spread across 6 wing-mounted machine guns. Duncan was a veteran of 47 combat missions, a survivor who had learned his craft through experience rather than ideology. His wingman, Ensign Thomas Parker, was on his 8th mission, still green but benefiting from Duncan's mentorship. Together, they climbed to intercept altitude, part of a combat air patrol screen that represented Okinawa's first line of defense. Duncan spotted them at 20,000 feet, a ragged formation of Mitsubishi Zeros, their paintwork faded, some trailing smoke even before engaging. These were the escort fighters tasked with protecting the kamikaze pilots until they reached their targets. Behind and below the Zeros came the kamikazes themselves, a mixed collection of obsolete aircraft, Ichi D-3A dive bombers allied codename Val, Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers Kate, and Yokosuka D-4Y bombers Judy, each loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb and just enough fuel for a one-way trip. Duncan rolled into his attack, Parker following his lead. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine roared as he dove. Building speed, the gunsight pipper settling on a Kate struggling to maintain formation. He pressed the trigger. 6 guns hammered, tracers arcing across the sky. The Kate's right wing shredded, but the pilot didn't break away. Instead, incredibly, he straightened his course, holding steady even as his aircraft began to disintegrate. Duncan fired again, a longer burst, and the Kate exploded in a ball of orange flame and black smoke. No parachute emerged from the fireball. There wouldn't be. Kamikaze pilots often flew without parachutes, the weight saved allowing for slightly more fuel or explosive payload. Some accounts documented in post-war interrogations of surviving maintenance personnel, and detailed in scholarly works such as The Sacred Warriors by military historian Richard O'Neill, suggests that certain kamikaze units removed landing gear to prevent pilots from having second thoughts, though this claim remains disputed. Parker engaged a valve that had slipped through the fighter screen. His gunnery was less precise, rounds sprang around the target. The valve's pilot, likely a teenager with minimal training, attempted a clumsy, evasive maneuver in instinctive response, suggesting incomplete psychological conditioning. Parker corrected his aim and fired again. This time the round struck true, raking the valve's fuselage. The aircraft fell away trailing smoke, but Parker noticed something that would haunt him afterward. The pilot appeared to be struggling with his controls, trying to maintain his heading toward the fleet below, even as his aircraft became unflyable. Aboard the USS Bush, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Several kamikazes had penetrated the fighter screen. The ship's 5-inch guns opened fire, filling the sky with proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells. 40mm Bofors guns joined in, then 20mm Oerlikons, creating a layered defense. But the mathematics were brutal. Historical analysis by naval warfare experts, including comprehensive examinations published by the Naval War College, demonstrates that even intensive anti-aircraft fire only achieved about 15% hit rates against diving kamikaze aircraft. April 7, 1945, Corporal Hajime Fuji awoke before dawn in his barracks at Kairon Air Base for what he knew would be the last time. He had received his orders the previous evening. Today was his designated departure day. Around him, 8 other pilots prepared for the same final mission, their movements quiet and ritualistic. Fuji folded his blanket with exaggerated care, arranged his few personal effects, and placed his last letter to his family on his bunk. The letter, like thousands of others written by kamikaze pilots, followed a prescribed format: expressions of gratitude, assurances of eagerness for the mission, declarations of loyalty to the Emperor, carefully avoiding any hint of doubt or fear that might distress his family or attract attention from military censors. After a sparse breakfast, the pilots proceeded to the briefing room, where flight operations officers provided final target information. Their objective: the American carrier task force supporting operations off Okinawa. The briefing was perfunctory. There was no discussion of contingencies, abort procedures, or alternative targets. The unstated assumption permeated every aspect of the preparation: these 9 men would not return. Maintenance crews had already removed excess weight from their aircraft and loaded 500-kilogram bombs. Fuel tanks were filled to approximately 70% capacity, enough to reach the target area but not enough for a return journey, a calculated measure to prevent pilots from changing their minds. At the flight line, well-wishers had gathered. Tome Torihama, the restaurant owner who had become a surrogate mother to so many doomed pilots, pressed small packages of rice balls into their hands, her eyes red from crying she would not let fall. A Shinto priest performed final purification rituals. Commanding officers delivered brief speeches, invoking national survival and historical destiny. Then came the ceremonial sake, consumed from shallow cups in a final toast to the Emperor and to Japan. Fuji climbed into his Yokosuka MXY-7. Oka the Cherry Blossom, a rocket-powered kamikaze aircraft that was essentially a manned bomb. Unlike conventional kamikaze planes, which were standard aircraft modified for suicide missions, the Oka was purpose-built for self-destruction. American pilots called it Baka, Japanese for idiot, a grim commentary on the weapon's singular, terrible purpose. The Oka had no landing gear. It would be carried aloft beneath a G-4M Betty bomber and released within range of the target fleet. Fuji's mission was simplified to the extreme: be released, ignite rockets, steer into target, die. The same morning, across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean at Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Robert Duncan climbed out of his Hellcat after returning from a dawn patrol. He had survived another mission, his 48th. Ground crew immediately began refueling and rearming his aircraft for the next sortie. The operational tempo off Okinawa was relentless. Unlike Fuji, Duncan could reasonably expect to see another sunrise. American doctrine invested heavily in keeping experienced pilots like Duncan alive because each combat mission made him more valuable, not less. He headed to debriefing, where intelligence officers meticulously recorded his observations: kamikaze tactics, vulnerable approach angles, effective defensive responses. The debriefing process exemplified American military culture's emphasis on institutional learning. Every engagement was analyzed, lessons extracted, tactics refined, and information disseminated across the fleet. Duncan's observations about the Kamikaze's inability to evade while maintaining attack heading would be typed up, circulated, and incorporated into defensive protocols. This systematic knowledge transfer meant that even rookie pilots benefited from the collective experience of the entire combat force. The organization was learning, adapting, becoming more effective with each encounter. Japanese military culture, by contrast, struggled with this kind of adaptive learning in the war's final stages. The Kamikaze program itself represented an abandonment of institutional knowledge preservation. Each suicide mission consumed an irreplaceable pilot whose experience died with him. The few pilots who survived aborted missions due to mechanical failures often faced shame and suspicion, rather than being systematically debriefed to improve future operations. Post-war analysis, including comprehensive studies conducted by U.S. strategic bombing survey teams that interviewed surviving Japanese military personnel, revealed significant organizational dysfunctions in how the Kamikaze program was managed. May 11, 1945. The destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley and its companion destroyer, USS Evans, found themselves isolated on radar picket station number 15, 75 miles north of Okinawa, directly in the path of a massive kamikaze attack. By 1000 hours, radar had detected the incoming rate approximately 75 aircraft. Commander Baron Mullaney, captain of the Hadley, ordered general quarters. His crew of 300 men raced to battle stations, knowing their position made them the first line of defense, and likely targets themselves. Historical accounts from the ship's action reports, preserved at the National Archives, describe what followed as one of the most intense anti-aircraft engagements of the Pacific War. The Combat Air Patrol 4 Corsairs, from Marine Fighter Squadron, EMF 2-1, engaged the attacking force at maximum range, splashing several kamikazes before being overwhelmed by numbers. One Corsair pilot, Captain Jeremiah O'Keefe, shot down 3 kamikazes in rapid succession before his aircraft was hit by debris from an exploding valve. O'Keefe managed to nurse his damaged Corsair back toward the fleet, demonstrating the emphasis American training placed on survival, even in extremis. He would ditch near a picket destroyer and be recovered within 20 minutes live, able to share his observations and capable of flying again once provided a new aircraft. Aboard the Hadley, gunners opened fire at 8,000 yards. The ship's 5-inch guns roared continuously, loading and firing as fast as human hands could work. 40mm quad mounts tracked targets, their mechanical predictors attempting to calculate intercept points for aircraft diving at 300 miles per hour. 20mm guns fired in streams of tracers that created deadly webs across the sky. The noise was apocalyptica, continuous thunder of explosions, the metallic clatter of shell casings hitting the deck, the whoosh of rockets from the ship's experimental anti-aircraft rocket launchers. The first kamikaze, a Judy dive bomber, penetrated the defensive fire and struck the Hadley's port side at the waterline. The explosion killed 11 men instantly and flooded 2 compartments. Damage control parties, trained extensively in emergency procedures, immediately responded, shoring bulkheads, fighting fires, treating wounded. The ship remained operational, continuing to fire. Minutes later, a valve crashed into the Hadley's aft deckhouse. The subsequent explosion destroyed the after engine room and knocked out the ship's aft 5-inch gun mount. 26 more men died. The ship began to list, yet the crew continued fighting. Forward guns remained in action. Damage control parties worked frantically to maintain buoyancy. Captain Mullaney, wounded but refusing evacuation, directed operations from the bridge. The tactical situation exemplified the fundamental difference between kamikaze and conventional warfare. In traditional combat, both sides sought positional advantage while minimizing risk. Here, the kamikazes sought death. The ships merely sought to survive long enough to kill their attackers first. The calculus was brutally simple. Could the ship's guns destroy incoming kamikazes faster than kamikazes could destroy the ship? The Hadley's gunners claimed 23 splashed. Kamikazes an extraordinary number that, if accurate, meant the crew had achieved exceptional defensive efficiency. But accuracy wasn't the only factor. Determination mattered. Training mattered. The knowledge that surrender meant certain death for the entire crew focused minds wonderfully. These American sailors fought not from ideological devotion or emperor worship, but from the practical understanding that survival required killing the enemy before the enemy killed them. By 1100 hours, the attack subsided. The Hadley, hit by 3 kamikazes and a bomb, was dead in the water, listing heavily, with 156 casualties, including 29 dead. Yet the ship remained afloat. Salvage vessels would eventually tow her to port. Most of her surviving crew would live to see war's end. The ship herself, though never returned to service, would survive to be scrapped rather than becoming a tomb at sea. June 3, 1945, at Kanoya Air Base in southern Kyushu, Ensign Takeshi Maeda sat in a crowded classroom learning navigation techniques he would never actually use. His instructors, exhausted veterans pulled from dwindling combat squadrons, taught abbreviated lessons focused solely on the outbound journey. There was no instruction in fuel management for extended patrols, no training in navigating back to base after losing visual reference points, no practice in the complex art of finding and landing on an aircraft carrier at sea. Such skills were irrelevant for one-way missions. Maeda was 19 years old. He had been studying literature at Kyoto University when conscription interrupted his education. Now, 6 weeks later, he was deemed ready to die for the emperor, despite having accumulated barely 40 hours in actual cockpits. The psychological toll of this truncated training was evident in his diary, portions of which were later preserved and published in collections of kamikaze writings. Maeda wrote of doubt carefully disguised as determination, of fear masked as eagerness, of a profound disconnect between the propaganda he mouthed publicly and the terror he confided to paper in private moments. The diary entries reveal an uncomfortable truth that challenges simplistic narratives about kamikaze pilots. While some certainly embraced the mission with genuine fervor, true believers, shaped by years of ultra-nationalist education, many harbored profound reservations they dared not express. The social mechanisms enforcing compliance were overwhelming. To refuse meant dishonoring family, violating the deepest obligations of Japanese culture, potentially exposing one's entire household to official persecution. In a totalitarian state where conformity was enforced through both legal penalties and social ostracism, the pressure to volunteer for suicide missions was nearly irresistible. American pilots faced different but still significant pressures. At Naval Air Station Fallon in Nevada, Lieutenant James Mitchell completed advanced carrier landing qualifications. His 197th practice landing on a simulated carrier deck. The repetition was deliberate. American training philosophy held that emergency procedures had to become instinctive, requiring no conscious thought when executed under stress. Mitchell and his fellow pilots certainly experienced fear, but it was fear tempered by extensive preparation and reasonable expectation of survival. The psychological support structures differed markedly as well. American military culture encouraged pilots to acknowledge fear and discuss stress. Flight surgeons monitored mental health alongside physical readiness. Pilots who exhibited signs of combat fatigue were rotated to rear areas for recovery. This wasn't softness. It was pragmatic recognition that psychologically damaged pilots were dangerous to themselves and their squadrons. The goal was sustainable combat effectiveness, not glorious death. Japanese military culture offered no such accommodation. Displays of fear or doubt were interpreted as moral weakness. Pilots experiencing mental distress had no official channels for support. The concept of combat fatigue was dismissed as Western weakness. Those who failed to perform were shamed rather than treated. This created a feedback loop where psychological problems intensified in silence until they erupted in breakdowns, or ironically given the mission parameters, suicides before the designated sacrifice. Maeda's diary documents his increasing psychological deterioration over the weeks leading to his final mission. Sleep deprivation, stress, inadequate nutrition, and the constant awareness of imminent death combined to produce symptoms recognizable to modern psychiatrists as severe anxiety and depression. Yet no intervention occurred. Instead, military authorities increased ideological indoctrination, held more ceremonies invoking divine protection, and emphasized group cohesion measures that addressed symptoms rather than causes. The contrast extended to how each military treated its pilots' final communications. American pilots wrote letters home that were actually delivered, uncensored expressions of affection, hope, and sometimes fear. Japanese kamikaze letters were heavily censored before delivery, stripped of anything that might undermine morale or suggest doubt. Families often received highly edited versions bearing little resemblance to what their sons had actually written. July 8, 1945, Admiral Raymond Spruance reviewed casualty reports aboard his flagship USS Indianapolis in the Philippine Sea. The Okinawa campaign now concluded. The statistics were sobering. American forces had destroyed approximately 4,000 Japanese aircraft, including roughly 2,000 kamikaze attackers. These suicide attacks had sunk 36 American ships, mostly destroyers and smaller vessels, and damaged another 368. Nearly 10,000 American sailors had been killed or wounded. By any measure, the kamikazes had inflicted significant damage. Yet when Spruance's staff completed their strategic analysis, documented and classified reports later declassified and now available through the National Archives, a different picture emerged. The kamikaze program had achieved tactical success but strategic failure. The approximately 4,000 pilots sacrificed had not fundamentally altered the war's trajectory. They had not stopped the American advance. They had not prevented Okinawa's capture. It had bought time, certainly, and inflicted casualties that shocked American public opinion. But they had exhausted Japan's remaining pool of trained aviators without achieving decisive results. The mathematics were instructive. 4,000 kamikaze deaths had sunk 36 ships, approximately 111 pilots per ship sunk. Traditional aerial combat earlier in the war had achieved better return on investment. At the Battle of Midway, Japanese losses were approximately 1 pilot per major ship sunk. The kamikaze exchange rate represented a dramatic deterioration in combat effectiveness, a symptom of decreasing pilot quality as Japan's trained aviators were consumed in suicide missions. American forces, meanwhile, had adapted. Improved radar picket arrangements provided earlier warning. Combat air patrols were strengthened and positioned more effectively. Fighter direction from ship combat information centers became more sophisticated. Most significantly, anti-aircraft gunnery improved dramatically. Gunners learned to recognize kamikaze attack patterns and developed specialized engagement techniques. The hit rate against kamikazes approximately doubled between the Philippines campaign and Okinawa as experience accumulated. Aboard the carrier USS Ticonderoga, Lieutenant Robert Duncan logged his 73rd mission, having survived the entire Okinawa campaign. He was now one of the most experienced fighter pilots in the fleet, his tactical knowledge shaped by dozens of kamikaze engagements. Unlike the Japanese pilots he fought against, most of whom had perished after fewer than 5 missions, Duncan's experience made him exponentially more valuable with each passing combat sortie. His survival represented not just individual fortune but systematic military competence in preserving scarce expertise. On Kyushu, the remaining kamikaze bases were becoming ghost towns. At Chiron, far fewer pilots underwent training as the pool of potential volunteers neared exhaustion. Japan had sent thousands of young men to die, but had failed to achieve the psychological breaking point among Chiron. American forces, that the program's architects had predicted, American resolve, contrary to Japanese military planners' assumptions, had not collapsed under kamikaze assault. Instead, American forces had grimly adapted and continued advancing. The disparity in training outcomes had become undeniable. American pilots completing their training programs in mid-1945 possessed 300 or more flight hours in comprehensive combat preparation. Japanese kamikaze pilots were being rushed through abbreviated courses with 40 hours or less. Some reports from interrogated Japanese personnel, documented in U.S. strategic bombing survey materials, described pilots with as few as 15 flight hours being sent on missions barely capable of takeoff and navigation, much less aerial combat. The institutional learning gap had widened catastrophically. American forces systematically incorporated lessons from each engagement, distributing tactical innovations across the entire fleet within days. Japanese forces, having committed to suicide attacks that prevented survivors from sharing experience, had no similar learning mechanism. Each kamikaze pilot essentially started from zero, unable to benefit from predecessors' experience because those predecessors were dead. August 10, 1945. Now 5 days after Hiroshima's destruction and 1 day after Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito prepared to announce Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast unprecedented in Japanese history. At Chiron Air Base, Lieutenant Takeshi Madahu had survived mechanical failures that aborted 3 separate kamikaze missions, learned that his 4th attempt, scheduled for the following day, had been canceled. The war was over. He had volunteered to die, but would instead live, carrying the complicated burden of survival when so many comrades had perished. Maida's subsequent life, like that of many surviving kamikaze pilots, was marked by psychological trauma that contemporary understanding would identify as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Interviews conducted decades later with kamikaze survivors, including extensive oral history projects preserved at Japanese institutions such as the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, reveal patterns of guilt, depression, and difficulty reintegrating into civilian society. These men had been psychologically prepared for death, had said farewell to families, had resolved themselves to sacrifice. Surviving meant confronting an existential void they had prepared for an ending that never came. But such arithmetic ignored critical factors. The sunk vessels were primarily destroyers, destroyer escorts, and small auxiliary ships. No American fleet carrier, battleship, or heavy cruiser was sunk by kamikaze attack, though several were damaged. The strategic objective breaking American will and forcing a negotiated peace failed completely. The United States did not waver. Its industrial capacity replaced losses faster than kamikazes could inflict them. American determination, contrary to Japanese assumptions, strengthened rather than weakened under attack. The cost to Japan was catastrophic. 5,000 dead pilots represented not just individual tragedies, but national impoverishment. These were educated young men, potential engineers, teachers, doctors, and leaders. Their deaths created demographic and intellectual voids. The psychological impact on Japanese society, families destroyed, communities traumatized, code for generations. Post-war Japan would struggle with the kamikaze legacy, alternating between honoring sacrifice and questioning the militaristic ideology that demanded it. American forces concluded the war with numerous experienced combat pilots. Lieutenant Robert Duncan survived to complete 87 missions, accumulated over 500 combat hours, and claimed 14 confirmed aerial victories. He returned home, used the GI Bill to complete his education, and lived to age 83. His survival represented the payoff of American doctrine: invest heavily in pilot training and survival systems. And the return on that investment compounds over time. The broader strategic implications were profound. The kamikaze program proved that fanaticism and willingness to die, while tactically dangerous, could not overcome material and organizational superiority. American forces possessed better aircraft, better training, better logistics, better tactics, and crucially, a sustainable system for preserving and transmitting combat experience. Japan's suicide doctrine, by contrast, consumed its human capital without generating lasting advantage. Post-war analysis, particularly comprehensive studies, conducted by military historians and documented in works such as The Divine Wind by Riki Hay, Inoguchi, and Tadashi Nakajima, former Japanese naval officers who survived the war, revealed internal Japanese military assessments were pessimistic even during the kamikaze campaign. Many senior officers privately questioned the program's strategic value, while publicly supporting it as dysfunction typical of authoritarian military. Cultures where dissent is suppressed even when correct. December 18, 1993, former Lieutenant Robert Duncan, now 71 years old, stood in the Shiran Peace Museum for kamikaze pilots in Kagoshima, Japan, studying photographs of young Japanese pilots who had died nearly 50 years earlier. He had returned to Japan multiple times since the war, initially on occupation duty, later as a tourist. Finally, as something approaching a pilgrim seeking to understand the enemies he had once fought. The faces staring from the photographs were impossibly young teenagers, mostly some looking barely 16, despite official records claiming they were older. Beside him stood Takeshi Maida, now 68, one of the rare survivors of the kamikaze program. The two men, once mortal enemies trained to kill each other, had corresponded for years and finally arranged this meeting. They walked slowly through the museum's exhibits, past the preserved letters, the faded uniforms, photographs of Torahama, with her adopted sons, who never returned. Both men wept, though for different reasons and at different displays. This scene, documented in a 1994 documentary and subsequent interview transcripts, encapsulated the complex legacy of the kamikaze phenomenon. The museum itself represented Japan's ambivalent relationship with this dark chapter. The exhibits honored the pilot's sacrifice while carefully avoiding glorification of the militaristic ideology that demanded their deaths. Young Japanese visitors could honor ancestors without embracing the nationalism that killed them. Delicate balance reflecting modern Japan's constitutional pacifism. Duncan shared his perspective in a recorded interview. "We were both victims of our government's decisions, but in fundamentally different ways. I was trained to survive and win. They were trained to die. Tragedy is that dying achieved nothing except more death." Maeda's response was more conflicted. "For decades, I carried shame for surviving when so many died. Japanese society didn't know how to treat us. Were we heroes who volunteered, or cowards who failed to complete our missions? Only in recent years have I come to understand that the shame belongs not to us pilots, but to the leaders who created a system demanding such sacrifice." The scholarly examination of the kamikaze phenomenon accelerated in the post-war decades as archives opened and participants aged enough to speak candidly. Research revealed that the program's architects had vastly miscalculated on multiple levels. They assumed American democratic culture would prove brittle under sustained casualties, that public opinion would force political leadership to negotiate. This fundamental misreading of American society, a mistake rooted in Japanese military culture's contempt for democratic systems, doomed the strategy from inception. Military analysts studying the program identified specific tactical and operational failures beyond the strategic miscalculation. The most damaging was the pilot quality deterioration. Early kamikaze attacks in the Philippines included experienced pilots who could navigate effectively, identify priority targets, and execute attacks with precision. By Okinawa, kamikaze formations included pilots barely capable of staying in formation, easily disoriented, unable to distinguish between ship types. This declining effectiveness corresponded directly with the consumption of trained pilots in non-survivable missions. The organizational dysfunction extended to aircraft allocation. Japan committed frontline combat aircraft to suicide missions, accelerating the depletion of its already inadequate air forces. Standard fighters and bombers that might have been used for conventional attacks, reconnaissance, or air defense were instead loaded with bombs and flown into ships by undertrained pilots. This represented a catastrophic misallocation of scarce resources, using precision instruments as crude hammers. American forces, by contrast, demonstrated organizational learning under pressure. The evolution of anti-kamikaze tactics over 8 months showed systematic adaptation. Initial defenses were adequate but imperfect. By war's end, the layered defense system, long-range fighter interception, medium-range fighter interception, medium-range fleet fighter engagement, massed anti-aircraft fire at close range, had become devastatingly effective. From approximately 60% to over 85% between October 1944 and August 1945. The training differential's long-term implications shaped post-war aviation. American emphasis on pilot survival and systematic knowledge transfer became the foundation for modern fighter pilot training worldwide. Programs like the U.S. Navy's Top Gun School, established in 1969, codified the principle that experience was too valuable to waste. Modern air forces universally reject suicide tactics, not just for ethical reasons, but because military analysis conclusively demonstrated their strategic ineffectiveness. The psychological dimension received extensive study. Mental health professionals examining kamikaze survivor testimonies identified patterns consistent with cult indoctrination, isolation from contrary viewpoints, elevation of group identity over individual welfare, authority figures demanding absolute obedience, and most critically, systematic suppression of natural self-preservation instincts. The parallel to modern suicide terrorism would become uncomfortably obvious to 21st century researchers, though critical differences existed in scale, organization, and cultural context. Japanese society's reckoning with the kamikaze legacy proved ongoing and difficult. Conservative factions lionized the pilots as patriotic heroes, symbols of selfless devotion. Progressive voices condemned the military leadership that demanded such sacrifice, viewing the pilots as victims of authoritarianism. The truth, as Maeda's testimony suggested, encompassed both perspectives. The pilots demonstrated courage facing death requires bravery regardless of whether the death serves worthy purposes. But their courage was exploited by a regime that had failed strategically and demanded blood payment from its youth rather than admit defeat. The Americans who fought against kamikazes carried their own complex legacy. Many, like Duncan, came to view their former enemies with a mixture of respect for individual courage and revulsion at the system that demanded suicide. Others remained angry, haunted by memories of ships burning, shipmates dying, and the existential terror of facing enemies who sought death. Post-traumatic stress affected American survivors too, though their trauma stemmed from surviving hell rather than from being denied martyrdom. The technological response to the kamikaze threat drove innovation in ways that shaped Cold War and modern warfare. Radar and fighter direction improved dramatically. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells miniature radar sets that detonated when near targets proved are more effective than time-fused or contact-fused shells. These innovations, forced by urgent necessity, later enhanced NATO's air defense capabilities against Soviet aviation. The kamikaze threat, perversely, made American forces more effective. Educational institutions worldwide studied the phenomenon as a cautionary tale. Military academies examined the kamikaze program as an example of strategic desperation masquerading as tactical innovation. Ethics courses debated whether individual sacrifice for national survival could ever justify suicide tactics. History departments explored how authoritarian regimes manipulated cultural values to override human survival instincts. The kamikaze became shorthand for fanaticism, for desperation, for the terrible things humans will do when ideology overwhelms reason. As Duncan and Maida concluded their museum visit, they paused before a wall bearing the names of over 1,000 kamikaze pilots who departed from Chiron. Most were between 17 and 23 years old. Their names, rendered in careful calligraphy, represented not just individual tragedies but a systemic failure nation so committed to its course that it consumed its children rather than admit error. Duncan placed his hand on the memorial wall, his fingers tracing names he couldn't read. "I killed some of them," he said quietly. "I had to. They were trying to kill me and my shipmates, but I never celebrated those kills the way I did with regular combat victories. Even then, we knew something was wrong about an enemy that wanted to die." Maida stood beside him, tears streaming. "They were my friends, my students, my comrades, and they were wasted, not by your bullets, but by our leaders' delusions. Every name here represents a potential future Japan lost doctors who would never heal, teachers who would never educate, fathers who would never raise children. We sacrificed our tomorrow for a yesterday that was already gone." The conversation between these two old warriors, documented extensively in subsequent publications and interviews, provided a fitting coda to the kamikaze story. It was not a tale of simple heroism or villainy, not a narrative of cultural superiority or inferiority. Instead, it revealed a profound truth about warfare and human nature. Systems matter more than individual courage. The most devoted pilot flying the most desperate mission cannot overcome fundamental strategic and organizational disadvantages. Fanaticism is no substitute for competence. Willingness to die cannot compensate for poor leadership, inadequate resources, and flawed strategy. The final accounting remains stark and undeniable. Japan trained pilots to die and consumed 5,000 of them in suicide attacks that failed to achieve strategic objectives. America trained pilots to survive and brought most of them home to share their experience, build the post-war world, and eventually reconcile with former enemies. One approach represented desperation disguised as devotion. The other represented competence disguised as caution. History rendered its verdict not through moral judgment, but throughout one nation, defeated and occupied, the other victorious and ascendant. The kamikaze pilots' courage was real. Their sacrifice was immense. But courage and sacrifice alone cannot redeem strategic bankruptcy or organizational dysfunction. That lesson, written in blood across Pacific skies, remains relevant wherever ideology demands ultimate sacrifice for doomed causes.